Hello, I'm Bob the Booker and welcome to my channel. And today I just wanted to talk about the books that I've been reading this week. And I'm now sort of back to normal-ish reading, which is fun. Yeah, so I'm really excited to talk about the books that I've been reading this week, which were mostly also while I was on holiday, which was also lovely. So yeah, let's get talking a bit about those, and I hope that you are having a good week. So first up, we have Call Me Ishmaelle by Xiaolu. And I previously read, I think, A Lover's Discourse by her, which is a wild and experimental and playful book. And in many ways, this book is quite playful, but has a more traditional narrative style. And in some ways, that is because of what it is doing here, which is being written as a sort of response or rewriting of Moby Dick, hence the title and this cover. And so in the original Moby Dick, you have this whole discussion of man versus whale and this obsession of Captain Ahab and everything else and all of this that goes into it. And what happens instead in this book is something slightly subtler, which I thought was quite interesting. It takes the idea of this, and we have a young woman called Ishmaelle, who goes to sea seeking adventure in a similar way to some of the men around her in her life. But she obviously chooses the name Ishmaelle because women are not allowed to be at sea at that time, and yada, yada, yada. Lots of things kind of go from that. I don't want to spoil how that story unfolds, but there's a lot that comes from that moment of her going out to sea, and particularly for the most part of this book, being hidden as a man. And so she has this interesting double life of essentially understanding what it's like to be taken as being a man by all the men around her on this boat, but also to experience their view of what's happening around them through their eyes. But at one point it is unveiled that she is a woman, and the book then takes a really interesting turn from there that plays with the original story of Moby Dick in a really fascinating way, I think, where it turns into more of a conversation about some other aspects of things. So not only is it this idea of man versus whale, but a woman potentially finding some kind of kinship with this idea of a whale being pursued, but then also that sets her up sometimes in opposition to the men around her, but sometimes makes them fellow kind of compatriots in this adventure. And it just becomes this very interesting, strange story from there. So I really enjoyed this. I thought this had something quite fun and playful to it that took the original, and it does follow a lot of things from the original very closely, but it also deviates in these quite interesting little side paths. So yeah, I think it's quite fun and quite worth it for that alone. Next up, I read The Harrow by Noah Eaton, and I was reading this as part of the Orwell Prize shortlist, and I found this really interesting in a separate kind of way to what I was expecting. It's a book that's essentially about a journalist, and particularly a journalist who is trying to uncover a story of what seems to be corruption at a government level, but is writing for a very small paper, a very kind of local paper. And this small paper is called The Harrow, and there's a joke constantly throughout the book that everyone believes it's associated with Harrow in London, but it's meant to be Harrow as in a rake, because it's raking up details and all these other things. But what this really turns into is some kind of crime thriller in some ways about trying to uncover a story, but equally this odd other story that is about the newspaper itself and this war of wills between the owner of this paper, who's this very stubborn man who in many ways is getting things done, but is not fully ready to acknowledge the fact that his newspaper is a tiny small fry operation that very few people read, but also understanding that this story could be the making of the paper. And so it kind of follows this story almost of subterfuge of what's going to happen to unveil this big story happening elsewhere. But also there's something quite funny about the way that this keeps on coming back to something very small and almost ridiculous, this idea of this very small paper that has these big ambitions that in some ways it's able to achieve, but in other ways it's completely off base with. So I enjoyed that about it as well. It's quite fun with the Orwell Prize to see books that are political in a sort of small p sense of, being about not party politics, not kind of wider sociopolitics, but this kind of idea of criminal espionage or like corruption at a local government level or whatever. And I thought this was quite fun, particularly if you like stories where you're trying to get to the bottom of some kind of, I suppose, mystery. The mystery is less kind of big and showy. It's not something you can necessarily solve yourself in the book, but it's something that where there's a sense of intrigue going on throughout of what this will ever turn into and whether this will be cut down in its tracks as well. So yeah, I really greatly enjoyed this. I thought this was quite funny and quite silly in many ways, but a really good novel at the heart of it, I think, as well. And last but not least, I read Deep House by Jeremy Atherton Lynn, and I really loved his last book, Gay Bar, which is a non-fiction book about the idea of why we would go out to bars, what bars are looking like now, and all of those sorts of things. And I really loved the style in that book that we see very much here with Deep House, of him taking a few different threads and kind of pulling at them all at the same time. And particularly in Deep House, I think this is so effective and so interesting because in some ways what we're seeing, you know, the heart of the book really seems to be Jeremy Atherton Lynn talking about his relationship with his partner, and particularly the ways that they can and can't have that relationship be visible to other people. So what some of the threads he starts pulling on are, for example, interracial relationships in the USA, or he starts pulling at gay marriage and same-sex relationship recognition in the US and in many other parts of the country, parts of the world rather. And so what you get is this really interesting patchwork of conversations happening, because on one end, you've got things like Prop 8 and the marriage bill in the US and many other things that go with that. And you've also got stories of somebody trying to find themselves as a naturalized citizen in the US and then be allowed to have an interracial relationship. And all of those are background to essentially this really beautiful core of this beautiful, beautiful story of these two men and their relationship. But it's written, it has this element of softness and beauty to it. But it never, for me, felt like it really went into this overly gushy thing. It would be so easy, I think, for a book like this to just be, let me tell everybody about how much I love you. And actually, instead, this book is something quite different. Whereas he touches on it, but he also writes about sex that they have together. He also writes about the difficulties of one of them meeting a parent, or of moving across a country or whatever. And so in many ways, this book is a love letter to his partner, but also a love letter to love and to the various structures and protests and actions that have gone into making sure that a relationship like theirs can be recognised and can be not illegal, essentially. And so there's so much that goes into this. I just found this utterly captivating and beautiful as a book. In many ways, parts of this feel like it shouldn't work, but there's something about the deftness of his tone and his writing that just it captures the whole thing altogether, particularly where sometimes it can feel like a real knee-jerk movement from one thing to another, where you go from him writing about a policy in the US that allowed for interracial relationships, and then the next moment he's writing about in really great detail about sex that he's having with his husband. And there's something about the way this book does that just feels completely natural to the book. It doesn't feel jarring, but it almost should be. In the hands of another writer, I think that could be. And I just really enjoyed this. I thought it was so beautifully done. The scenes about love are so poignant. The scenes about sex are sexy. The scenes about politics feel like they capture the real resonance of what's happening there. These moments of him talking about working in a video store when he's like a teenager or in his early 20s feel really beautiful and also pivotal to the conversation. I think it's so well done, and I just really loved this. I thought this was so clever as a book, and I loved Gay Bar for similar reasons, but I think this feels like an even added step of maturity to his writing that's so beautiful and interesting. And I think having both books side by side is such a gorgeous thing as well. So yeah, I loved this. So those are the books I've been reading this week. I hope you're having a really lovely week yourselves. Take care and speak to you all soon. Bye bye.